Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding the Mishnah Berurah Gimel on Yetz Hashem. Today, we will be learning Daf Kuf Mem Tes Amud Aleph. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Shabbos. We pick up today 3 lines off the bottom of Kuf Mem Ches Amud Beis, Siman Shin Chaf Aleph Sif Yud Aleph. Continuing to learn the halachas of Teichen, even though today we're going to have a brief segue from the topic of Teichen into something else, and then we're going to come back to Teichen. Our learning today should be as chus for Achenu Kameis Yisrael, Hanasunim Batzaru Bashivya, Ha'imdim Bein Bayamu Bein Bayabasha, Hamakim Yerachim Aleihem, V'Yitziah Mitzara L'Rvacha, Me'afela L'Oira, Mishibur L'Geula, Hashta Bagala V'Zman Kariv and Emar Amen. Our learning should be as chus Refu Shalema for Yehoshua Levi ben Ahuva Malkachana, Moshe Meir ben Esther Fradel, Yitzhak ben Tzion ben Dusha, Rivka bas Shira Leah, Chava Hadassah bas Serel. They should have a Refu Shalema b'Sach Shar Chayle Yisrael. The limud HaTorah of Klal Yisrael should be as chus. The Rebbe Shem should watch over Gans Klal Yisrael b'chol makom shehem. So, says the Mechaber Sif Yud Aleph, Mutter lahashkois es hatolush. You're allowed to water something that is separated from the ground, kedei shelo yichmosh, so that it should not wilt. Okay, what does this mean? Says the Mechaber, says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Katan Lamed Zayin. Es hatolush, you're allowed to water something that is separated from the ground. Hainu yerakos tlushin. What the Mechaber means over here are vegetables that are detached from the ground. So what are you allowed to do? If you have vegetables that were already picked, so you know, very often when you go to the supermarket to buy your vegetables, you have the vegetables are in bins, and they have these sprayers that go on every few minutes and spray out a mist and wet down the vegetables. Why are they doing that? Apparently it's good for the vegetables, right? So apparently it prevents the vegetables from drying out and wilting. That's what we're speaking about over here. You have vegetables, and remember back in the day they didn't have refrigeration. You need to be able to do what you can to keep the vegetables fresh. One thing that they would do is they would wet the vegetables. That's what the Mechaber is talking about. Hani Yerakos Telushin. Okay, so now what's the halach the Mechaber is telling you? You're allowed to water these cut vegetables. Now, what would be the reason to think that you cannot cut them? I mean, to water vegetables that are attached to the ground, that's definitely a problem. That's going to be an issa daraisa. There's going to be a machlokes whether or not that's zayreya. Is that also under the rubric of zayreya, planting and making something grow? Or is it also under the av malacha of chayrish, of plowing? Why should it be plowing? To water something that's growing? Because when you water, one of the things that you do is you soften the earth, which could be a telada of chayrish. That's what plowing does. It breaks up and it softens the earth. But we understand why watering something that's growing, that's attached from the ground, we understand why that's usser. But why would we think that there should be an isser to water cut vegetables? What isser would that be? Explains the Mishnah Berurah, Vatam, the reason why it's mutter to go ahead and water these cut vegetables is Kaven dehem ru'uyos la'achila b'yoman, since these are vegetables that are able to be eaten, they're roy la'achila hayom, they stand ready to be eaten today on Shabbos, mutter lahashkoisam. That's why it's mutter to water them. Ma she'ein kein b'davar she'eino roy la'achila. But let's say we're not talking about watering lettuce that's ready to be eaten, cucumbers that are ready to be eaten, scallions that are ready to be eaten. Let's say that's not what we're talking about. Let's say we're talking about watering something that's not roy la'achila, aser l'trayach b'shvilam. Then there would be an isser to water them, even though there's no zereya here, there's no chayrish here, it would be aser to water something that is detached from the ground, even though it's something that originally grew from the ground, now it's detached from the ground, it would be aser to water them. Why? Because of tircha. because this would be something which would be considered a tircha yisera, which is inappropriate for Shabbos. And the Mishnah Berurah tells us, Va'ayin l'kamon b'simin shin lamid vav sif yud aleph b'hagah. He sends us to Siman Shin Lamed Vav. We should get there, Be'ez Hashem Yisparach, and learn it together in good health. B'hagah, he sends us to the Ramah in Shin Lamed Vav Yud Aleph. What does the Ramah say over there? So the truth is that what the Ramah says over there seems to contradict what we're saying over here. The Ramah in Shin Lamed Vav is talking about somebody that has pretty branches or flowers. Somebody has flowers that were cut before Shabbos, and now on Shabbos, you want to go ahead and you want to put them into water. The Ramah over there says, you want to take roses, cut roses, and you want to put them into water. The Ramah says you're allowed to put them into water with a caveat, a very important caveat. So long as the flowers aren't going to open as a result of you putting them into water. If the flowers are going to open because you're putting them into water, so then there's an inyan of pricha. Then it looks, in a sense, like the flowers are growing because you're affecting a change to the flower or the branch by putting it in water. But if it's something that's going to remain static, it's something that's going to remain the way it is. So let's say you have a branch that has pretty leaves on it, and it's putting it in water is not going to affect any change. But what it will do is it will keep it fresh. The Ramah over there says you could take it and you could stick it into water. Now let's follow the math. What we're learning over here is you have vegetables that are talush. You're allowed to go ahead and you're allowed to water them to keep them fresh. Says the Mishnah Berurah, why is this mutter? The Mishnah Berurah says the reason it's mutter is because since they're royal achila on Shabbos, since these vegetables stand ready to be eaten on Shabbos, watering them to keep them fresh is not considered a tercha yisera. It's not an inappropriate tercha because you're keeping your lettuce fresh. You'll have a nice salad by shalosh hodas. So therefore, it's not a problem. But if it's not royal achila, then it should be a problem. Yet in Shin Lamed Vav, the Ramah over there is talking about things that are not royal achila. A branch with pretty leaves, a flower that doesn't open up, it's not royal achila, so why are you allowed to water it? So it seems to be a direct stira. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ubema shekasavnu sham b'Mishnah Berurah eins katan nun dalet. If you want to know the answer to the stira, you have to take a look at the Mishnah Berurah over there, eins katan nun dalet. And over there, the Mishnah Berurah brings down two different ways to resolve this stira. One way to resolve the stira is, he says the heter of the Ramah in Shin Lamed Vav, to take the branches and put them into the water, is not a heter to put branches into water initially, lechatchila. The heter of Shin Lamed Vav, says the Mishnah Berurah, is if you had these kind of branches that were already in water before Shabbos, and you took them out of the water on Shabbos for some reason, you're allowed to go ahead and be machzir them to the water. You're allowed to put them back into the water. Over here, in Shin Chaf Aleph, we're talking about initially watering these cut vegetables. Over here, the heter to initially water the cut vegetables is because it's not considered a tercha yisera because they're royal achila hayoim. In Shin Lamed Aleph, Shin Lamed Vav, even though we're talking about things that are not royal achila, there's a heter to put them back into the water. You wouldn't be allowed to initially water them. That's one resolution that the Mishnah Berurah gives. The other one that he gives is a bigger heter in Shin Lamed Vav. He says, if in Shin Lamed Vav, what it's saying is, if you had water that was prepared before Shabbos, so you filled up a vase with water before Shabbos, now you want to take the branches that are not royal achila and you want to stick them in, that's all right. We're not going to answer that because of tercha yisera. But to fill up a vase with water and put the branches in, that we would answer for tercha yisera because they're not royal achila. But if we're dealing with vegetables, we would even let you go ahead and fill up a keli and put the vegetables in, because since they're royal achila, it's not considered a tercha Yisera. Let's finish this Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah, lahashkeises hamechuber, to water something that's attached to the ground, yesh by iser Torah. That would be an iser daraisa, like I explained to you. It would either be an iser of zereya or an iser of chayrish. Says the Mishnah Berurah, another halacha, uklicheres im isvei boisem babayis. If you have a flower pot, an earthenware flower pot, and it's filled with earth, and you have some kind of herbs growing in this flower pot, Gamken also lahashkoison b'Shabbos, you're also not allowed to water something that's growing in a flower pot on Shabbos. Now, when something is growing in a flower pot on Shabbos, watering it could be an issa d'Rabbanan, or it could be an issa d'Oraisa. We're not going to go now into the details of flower pots and when flower pots are considered mechubal karka, when flower pots are considered not to be mechubal karka, when the flower pot's considered mechubal karka, to water it would be an issa d'Oraisa. When the flower pot is not considered mechubal karka, then to water it is only an issa d'Rabbanan, pashtus. But either way, to water anything in the flower pot is definitely usher. It's either an issa d'Rabbanan or an iser daraisa. So the recap over here of Sif Yud Aleph, which, like I said, is a little bit of a diversion. We went away for Teichen for the moment, and now back to Yud Beis. We're going to return to the topic of Teichen. But here in Yud Aleph, I guess the Mechaber did this because we were discussing the questions of different types of food, and we're about to go into discussing vegetables. So the Mechaber saw fit to divert for a moment and speak about watering vegetables to keep them fresh. And the Mechaber told us you could go ahead and wet down your vegetables that are talush. If they're already cut off from the ground, you're allowed to go water them down on Shabbos in order to keep them fresh. What was the possible issue? The potential issue was an issue of tercha yisera. But this is not called a tercha yisera because these vegetables stand ready to be eaten today on Shabbos, so it's considered a tercha for Shabbos. Now we go to Sif Yud Beis, a sif that is very, very, very much negeya halacha l'maisa. So we're speaking here about the malacha of Teichen. Now, essentially, what is the malacha of Teichen? By Teichen, you're taking something that grows from the ground. In its natural state, it is a larger piece. So we could be talking, let's say, about wheat kernels. You take a wheat kernel, you want to grind it down. You want to do Teichen. You want to do grinding in order to convert it into flour. What do? You grind it. Essentially, you're taking a larger piece and you're reducing it to very, very small particles. Now, the Av Malacha of Teichen, when we speak about grinding, especially if we're learning it out from the grinding of wheat or barley into flour, let's say grinding wheat into flour to produce the lechem hapanim in the Mishkan, or grinding down wheat in order to create silas, in order to create fine flour for the carbon mincha, for the various menachas that are brought on the mizbeach. Over there, you're taking wheat kernels and you're converting it into flour. Now, when you convert wheat kernels into flour, you're making a very, very, very significant change. You're really changing the format. I think format is the right word, the word that I'm looking for. I think format. You're really changing the format of the item. Wheat kernels are coarse individual pieces. When you grind it down into flour, you're grinding it down into very, very tiny particles so that you can mamish take a scoop and scoop up a scoop of flour. It almost looks like that scoop of flour is one mass. It kind of holds together, right? Yeah, it is very, very tiny particles, but you're really making a very overall change in the goof of the item. You're really changing that item. The change from wheat kernels to flour, very, very, very significant change. That's the Av Malacha of Teichen. The Rishonim, including the Rambam, they say that the Tolada of the Malacha of Teichen is any time you take something that in its natural state is a larger piece and you go ahead and you reduce it into smaller pieces, you grind it or cut it up into small pieces, that is a Tolada of the Malacha of Teichen. So now the Mechaber is going to discuss taking vegetables and cutting them up into small pieces. So you take a cucumber, right? You take a cucumber and you dice up a cucumber into little pieces. So you took something which in its natural state is a nice big piece, and you cut it up into small pieces. Now, this is not really the same as taking wheat kernels and grinding it down into flour, right? The change from wheat kernels to flour is a much bigger change than cucumber to diced cucumber. As a matter of fact, just look at how we refer to it. We have, on the one hand, we have wheat kernels. On the other hand, we have flour, right? When you go to the store to buy flour, you do not buy ground wheat, right? You'll never see a bag that says a 5-pound bag, ground wheat. That's not what it says. It's flour. It might say wheat flour, but it's flour. Whereas diced cucumbers are diced cucumbers. So the change is not as significant. Cucumber to diced cucumber is not akin, really, to wheat kernels to flour. That's why wheat kernels to flour seems to be the av malacha, and cucumbers to diced cucumbers is a tolada. It's not the av. Having said that, it's still an issa daraisa, right? An av is an issa daraisa, a tolda is an issa daraisa. So it's still an issa daraisa. That's what we're going to be discussing now. The question of cutting vegetables into small pieces, reducing the big vegetable into small pieces by cutting it up or grinding it up. So says the Mechaber, Hamechatech hayerek dak dak. If somebody cuts up a vegetable into small pieces, dak dak means small, small, teeny weeny. Somebody cuts up a vegetable into small pieces. Chayiv mishum toichen. Issa daraisa, says the Mechaber. Chayiv. What does chayiv mean? If you did this b'shoigig, you would be chayiv to bring a carbon chatos. That means that this is an issa daraisa. Hamechatech hayerek dak dak. You cut up a vegetable very, very small. That is the issa daraisa of toichen. Okay. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Katan Lamed Ches. And we have to pay very close attention over here because we're about to have a Ramah. The Ramah is going to be a very interesting Ramah. The Mishnah Berurah on the Ramah is going to be somewhat problematic. And the problem of the Ramah, the problem that I have with the Ramah, is largely going to be resolved by a Bir Halacha. But this is a very interesting, a very tricky piece of Mechaber, Mishnah Berurah on the Mechaber, and then Ramah and the Mishnah Berurah on the Ramah. Very tricky. So again, the Chaber said, you take vegetables and you cut it up into small pieces. Chayiv mishum toichen. This is an issa daraisa of toichen. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Katan Lamed Ches, Hamechatech hayerek tolush. Obviously, we're talking about a vegetable that has already been cut off from the ground. If we're talking about a vegetable that's attached to the ground on Shabbos, well, then to go cut it off the ground to harvest it, that would be a different issa daraisa. That would be an issa daraisa of koitzer, right? So we're talking here about a cucumber that's already tolush. It's already separated from the ground. Now, says the Mishnah Berurah, umidisasam, from the fact that the Mechaber wrote this in a very general way. What the Mechaber said was, you take a vegetable, you cut it into small pieces, it's a daraisa of toichen. Says the Mishnah Berurah umidisasam, from the fact that the Mishnah Berurah wrote this in such a general way, mashma, the clear implication of the Mechaber is, da'afilu b'yerokoi sheroi l'ochlon chayin, even if you're talking about vegetables that could be eaten the way they are. Chayin over here does not mean raw. Chayin means in their current state. Even a vegetable that could be eaten the way it is. A cucumber. A cucumber, you could wash it and you could eat it exactly the way it is. It does not need to be cut up or ground in order to be eaten. Now, again, the Mechaber says, cut a vegetable, dak, cut a vegetable into little pieces, it's a daraisa. The Mechaber does not differentiate and say, oh, if it's a vegetable that can't be eaten without cutting it up, it's an issa daraisa. No, any vegetable, even if it could be eaten the way it is, to cut it up is an issa daraisa. Now, This is very important. This diuk in the Mechaber is a critical diuk. Why? Because it explains the Mishnah Berurah again, when we discuss from the fact that Mechaber wrote it in such a general way, mashma, the clear implication is he's talking about even vegetables that could be eaten in their present state without cutting them up or grinding them up. Gam kein svirale, he still holds the yesh tchina ba'oichlin. We discussed this in the previous year. We said there are shittas that hold ein tchina ba'oichlin. What does that mean, ein tchina ba'oichlin? There's no isser of grinding by foodstuffs? Of course there is. Grinding wheat kernels into flour. That's foodstuffs. That's the av malach of teichen. Of course there's an isser tchina ba'oichlin. What does it mean, ein tchina ba'oichlin? That was something that we saw in the Mishnah Berurah Ois Kat Lamed Gimel. We saw the explanation of that. The shittas that hold ein tchina ba'oichlin, what they hold is, if you have a food that could be eaten in its current state, and you go ahead and you grind it up, even though it doesn't really need grinding, they hold that that's not the Daraisa of grinding. Why? Because it's not significant. If the food could be eaten the way it is, then grinding it is insignificant. It's not considered a significant malacha. But over here, you see that the Mechaber doesn't hold that way. The Mechaber says you can't dice up a vegetable into small pieces, even if it could be eaten the way it is. So the Mechaber clearly holds yesh tchina ba'oichlin. Even though you can eat it the way it is, grinding it up is significant, and it's so significant that it's an issa daraisa. Okay, now we have to pause here for a second, and we have to kind of pull out a couple of the rules that we saw so far before we go to the Ramah. So, in Sif Tes, the Mechaber told us that you're allowed to take cooked meat or roasted meat, and you're allowed to cut it up into tiny little pieces. And there's no isser of teichen. And the Mishnah Berurah told us that the reason for this heter is based on the combination of two kulas. What is it based on? First of all, meat is not gedulei karka. We spoke in the Mishnah Berurah the fact that cows eat from the ground, fine. But we said that cows are not considered gedulei karka. And therefore, we're looking at this shaila, are you allowed to cut up meat into tiny pieces? Well, you're not dealing with gedulei karka. And a lot of shittas hold that the real isser of tchina is only by gedulei karka. It's not by things that are not gedulei karka. So heter number one, meat, it's not gedulei karka, there's no isser tchina. Kula number two, that we're going to be mitzaref with that, is even if you want to argue that cows are gedulei karka, because they're nourished from the ground, there's another heter. What's the other heter? Ein tchina ba'oichlin. That the isser of tchina does not apply when something could be eaten as is, and the meat could be eaten as is. Therefore, grinding it up, insignificant, therefore, there's no tchina. Now, you'll argue, well, didn't the Mishnah Berurah just make a diuk in the Mechaber in Sif Yud Beis that the Mechaber holds yesh tchina ba'oichlin? Yes. Halacha l'maisa, the Mechaber paskins yesh tchina ba'oichlin. But in Sif Tes, by Basar, the Mechaber is being mitzaref to kulas. He's saying, look, you have shittas that say ein tchina ba'oichlin. I paskin yesh tchina ba'oichlin. But there are shittas that hold ein tchina ba'oichlin. And cows not really gedulei karka. So to grind up, to cut up meat into tiny pieces with a knife, you can't use a grinding implement. You can't use a keli that's miyuchad l'tchina. That you zicha can't do. But, said the Mechaber, to go ahead and use a knife and cut up meat into small pieces, said the Mechaber, that's going to be mutter, because we're going to combine these two kulas. We're going to say, cows, not gedulei karka, and ein tchina ba'oichlin. So to cut up meat into small pieces is going to be mutter. That's what we saw in Sif Tes. Comes Sif Yud Beis, and the Mechaber starts talking about vegetables. Vegetables, says the Mechaber, you cannot cut up into small pieces. Why? Because vegetables are gedulei karka. Since vegetables are gedulei karka, okay, all bets are off. Nobody's matir tchina by gedulei karka, right? Vegetables are gedulei karka. And we see from the Mechaber in Sif Yud Beis that me'ikar adin, the Mechaber also holds yesh trina ba'ichlin. And therefore, even something like a cucumber that could be eaten the way it is without cutting it up, yesh trina ba'ichlin. So in Sif Yud Beis, what we have is, all right, cucumber, gedule karka. So the malacha of Teichen Zichar applies, and even though it could be eaten the way it is, we're going to answer it because the Mechaber Paskins yesh trina ba'ichlin. Okay, against that backdrop comes along the Ramah. Says the Ramah Hagah, V'hu adin, the same halacha applies. The same iser that I just told you, that you're not allowed to cut up vegetables dak dak. Says the Ramah, V'hu adin, the same halacha applies. The aser lachtoich gregoris v'charuvim lifnei zekenim. You're not allowed to cut up dried figs or carob for elderly people. Elderly people, it's difficult for them to eat. It's difficult for them to chew. You want to serve them something like a dried fig. You want to cut it up into little pieces. Says the Ramah, you're not allowed to do that. Well, let's do the math for a second. The Mechaber told me you're not allowed to cut up a cucumber. Okay. Comes along the Ramah, says, okay, you're also not allowed to cut up a dried fig. What exactly is the difference between a dried fig and a cucumber? A dried fig is also gedule karka, right? So you're not allowed to cut up a cucumber because it's gedule karka. It's also, it could be eaten the way it is, and the Mechaber says it's still also. Comes along the Ramah, you can't cut up a dried fig to give it to an elderly person. Well, it's gedule karka, and really a dried fig could be eaten the way it is also. Exactly what is the Ramah adding? So to kind of answer that question, let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah in Ice Cotton Lamites, the Mishnah Berurah points out that the Ramah said an interesting thing. What the Ramah said was that you're not allowed to cut up a dried fig for who? For an elderly person. What's epis an elderly person? Why is the Ramah talking Badafka here about an elderly person? Well, says the Mishnah Berurah, Lefnei zekenim, she'ein yecholin le'la asai im lo yachtechenu dak dak. Why are you cutting up this dried fig for this elderly person? Because the elderly person has a hard time chewing. And if you don't cut it up, he's not going to be able to eat it. All right, so what's the Ramah telling me? Sounds like the Ramah is telling me you're not allowed to cut up a dried fig for an elderly person because an elderly person can't eat it unless you cut it up. Ooh, if he can't eat it unless you cut it up, then by cutting it up, you're doing something very significant. Sounds like the Ramah is saying, why is it usher? Because you're doing something very significant. Okay, let's continue the Mishnah Berurah. Hold that thought. We don't look at it like we did in Siftes Ayin Sham in the Mishnah Berurah. We don't look at the dried fig and say, nah, you're not really doing something significant. Most of the world could eat the dried fig the way it is. It's only the elderly person who can't eat it the way it is. So your cutting it up is insignificant. No, we don't say that. We say it is significant because you're cutting it up for an elderly person who can't chew it. So he needs you to cut it up, so you're doing something significant, so it's also. The Kavan Chu Gdule Karka Chomer Yoiser. Says the Mishnah, why are we being so machmer? Because dried fig, Gdule Karka, we have to be machmer. The Iker Tchina B'Gdule Karkahu. By meat, we had a heter that it's not Gdule Karka. Over here, by dried fig, we don't have the heter that it's not Gedule Karka. We don't have the heter. So what are we going to do? We got to be machmer. Okay. Now, when you walk away, sorry, pardon me here for a second. Okay. When you walk away from this Ramah and this Mishnah Berurah over here, you kind of get the feeling that what the Ramah is saying is you can't cut up a dried fig for an elderly person. Why? Because the elderly person can't eat it without you cutting it up. Therefore, when you cut it up, you're doing something significant. Therefore, it becomes aser als teichen. Okay, so now let me ask you a question. Are you allowed to cut up a dried fig for a teenager who could eat it without cutting it up? Sounds from this Mishnah Berurah, you would be tempted, when you look at this Mishnah Berurah, you would be tempted to say, yes, To cut it up for an ordinary person wouldn't be a problem, because when you cut it up for an ordinary person, you're not doing anything significant. He could eat it the way it is, right? L'chayra, you would want to say that, but you can't say that. And the reason you can't say that is because of the previous Mishnah Berurah. Mishnah Berurah is kat lamad ches. In Mishnah Berurah is kat lamad ches, the Mishnah Berurah told me that the mechaber holds 100%, yesh tchina ba'ichlin, and therefore you can't cut up a cucumber, even though everybody can eat a cucumber exactly the way it is, but you still can't cut it up, because yesh tchina ba'ichlin. Now, you want to tell me that the Ramah is b'yichelik on the mechaber? You can't really tell me that the Ramah is b'yichelik on the mechaber. First of all, nobody here on the page suggests that the Ramah is b'yichelik on the mechaber, and second of all, the Ramah says v'hu adin. But you don't see anywhere here in this Ramah that the Ramah is b'yichelik on the mechaber. So it seems that the Ramah also holds that yesh tchina ba'ichlin. So exactly what is the Ramah saying? And why does the Mishnah Berurah in Oiskat Lamed Tes leave open this implication that the Ramah holds that to cut it up for anybody else would be mutter because it could be eaten the way it is? The answer to this question is found in the Bir Halacha Dibra Maschil Lifnei Zikenim. And the answer seems to be that the Magen Avram Taka learns the Ramah that the Ramah is matter to cut up a groigros for a young person. Why? Because it's insignificant, because he could eat it the way it is. And it would seem that according to the Magen Avram, the Ramah is b'yichelik on the mechaber. But the Bir Halacha is very unhappy with this. And the Bir Halacha says, doesn't sound like that to me. The Bir Halacha says, and you can see this, it's in the Bir Halacha on Kuf Mem Tes Amud Aleph, the Chavetz Chaim writes, "V'lanias daiti ain't dvar mechrachin." The Chavetz Chaim, who gives such tremendous allegiance to the Magen Avram all the time, he says, "Lanias daiti, my humble opinion, ain't dvar mechrachin." The words of the Magen Avram over here are not muchrach. The nakat lifnei zkenim mishum urcha demilsa sheim einim yichelim lechalim lo yachtachem dak dak. The way the Chavetz Chaim learns this Ramah is that the Ramah saw the mechaber. The mechaber said, you can't cut up a cucumber, picking on cucumbers. You can't dice a cucumber into small pieces. Why? Because it's gedulei karka. Since it's gedulei karka, that's the ikar iser of tchina, is by gedulei karka. It could be eaten the way it is. Yesh tchina b'ichlin. Comes along the Ramah, and the Ramah just wants to give a very practical case. Says the Ramah, realize that based on this halacha of the mechaber, that you can't cut up, let's say, a cucumber, you also cannot do something that is very commonly done. You can't take a groigris and cut it up for a zaken. A lot of people would take something like a groigris and they would cut it into small pieces so that their elderly grandfather could go ahead and eat it. Says the Ramah, you should know you can't do that. Why can't you do it? Not because, you're doing it for an elderly person, so it's significant. No, the reason you can't do it is because it's gedulei karka, and yesh tchina b'ichlin, and you're not allowed to do it. Finished. The reason you're not allowed to do it is because it's exactly the same as a cucumber. That's why you can't do it. You don't have to come on to anything else. You don't have to come on to what the Mishnah Berurah writes in Oiskat Lamed Tes. We don't go basar ruba da alma. No, it doesn't matter. Even if you went basar ruba da alma, and you would say that, what do you mean? You're not making a significant change, because everybody can eat it the way it is, it still would be usher. The same way the cucumber is usher. It would still be usher. All the Ramah is doing is, he's speaking about a very common case. But at the end of the day, that means that any vegetables, any fruits, you can't go ahead and dice them into very small pieces, because you're going to come up against this problem of teichen. Now let's go weiter. Says the Ramah, bottom line, V'dafka peiros v'chadoyma lo zeh aser. But this iser only applies to fruits and things like fruits. Aval, however, mutter lefarer lechem lifnei tarnagolim. You're allowed to take bread and crumble it up into small pieces for the chickens. Why? Tahoyelu kvar nitchan ein lachush. Because since bread is made out of something that was already ground into small pieces. What? Flour. When you grind up bread, you're not something that exists in its natural state in a big piece. No. You made bread out of flour. Flour was already wheat kernels that were ground down into flour. You baked it and you created a mass out of it. Now you're again reducing it to small particles. That's toichen achar toichen. Toichen achar toichen is mutter. The hoil ukvar nitchan ein lachush de ein toichen achar toichen. We don't have an isser of toichen achar toichen. Says the Mishnah Berurah, cut mem lefar lechem, you're allowed to crumble up bread. Hainu afilu lahachid lehem sheyochlu laachazman ukid lekamei. This is mutter, even without employing the heter of the Ramah, which we've spoken about already many times, but we haven't seen it yet inside. And that is the Ramah's heter, that the same way by Berurah, there's a heter to do Berurah. If one of the mitigating factors of Berurah is you're doing it la'alter, you're doing it for immediate use, so too we're going to see that the Ramah has a heter to do teichen if you're doing it for immediate use. Says the Mishnah Berurah, the Ramah, when he tells you you're allowed to crumble up bread, you don't have to come on to the Ramah's heter of la'alter. It's mutter even if you're doing it to put it into a container to serve it to the chickens later. Can't do it if you're doing it to serve it to the chickens on Sunday, because that would be hachana. But you could do it Shabbos morning to serve it to the chickens late Shabbos afternoon. Why? Because it's not teichen. Why isn't it teichen? Because ein teichen achar teichen. Eis cut mem aleph the hoil. Ulafizah, according to this, says the Mishnah Berurah, lefarer tapuche adama, to crumble up a raw potato. V'yarakos, or vegetables, lifnehem dak, to take a cucumber and dice it into small pieces, take a potato and crumble it up into small pieces, like people do to serve to their animals and to their fowl. Aser would be aser. Why? Gedule karka. You don't have a heter here of ein teichen achar teichen. These are not things that were already ground. The only heter that you could possibly have to do this is the Ramah's heter that we're going to see shortly of la'alter. But you don't have a heter of ein teichen achar teichen. Nevertheless, having said that, having said what? Having just told you that if you do it samach la'achilasan, it's mutter. Having just told you that perhaps you could rely on the Ramah's heter of la'alter, what the Mishnah Berurah is telling you over here is that even if you're doing this for people, not for animals, by animals there's another problem, and that is that you can't do a terchi yisera for animals. So if the animal can eat the potato without you crumbling it up, or if the animal can eat the cucumber without you crumbling it up, you're not allowed to cut it up for another reason, and that is terchi yisera. But what the Mishnah Berurah is telling you over here is, even if you're doing it for people, and even if you're doing it samach l'suda, still you should be nizar to make it big pieces. Now this Mishnah Berurah that we just learned is going to be one of the sources in the Mishnah Berurah, and we'll see him say it much clearer, where it's clear for the Mishnah Berurah that the Mishnah Berurah wants to be mechaber like the Beis Yosef. The Beis Yosef holds that we should not really follow the heter of the Ramah of la'alter. He's very uncomfortable with the Ramah's heter, and he says that we shouldn't cut small pieces, even la'alter. Okay, now let's go weiter in the Mishnah Berurah. Finally, we're going to come to this heter that we keep on referencing. Second line down, a little bit past the middle of the line, by the ois cut mem beis for the Mishnah Berurah, says the Ramah, V'chol zeh loi mairi. This whole discussion of cutting vegetables into small pieces, this whole isser, it only applies when you want to cut something up and you want to store it for later use. But to cut up something into even small pieces for la'alter use, for immediate use, shari. Says the Ramah, you want to make a real genuine Israeli salad, you want to dice up cucumbers into tiny pieces. Says the Ramah, if you're doing it right before Shalosh Shudas for Shalosh Shudas, says the Ramah, it's mutter. Midi dehevi aberer. The same way we find a heter of la'alter by berer, we have a heter of la'alter by toichen as well. Midi de hava abayr lechol miyad de shari kedala'el simin shin yotes. Now, what is the heter of la'alter use by bayr? The heter of la'alter use by bayr is, we said, that's not called derech bayr. That's called derech achila. To go ahead and do your selecting, to select and eat, that's derech achila. That's not derech bayr. Derech bayr is, I'm making a selection project. I'm separating things out so I could parcel them out into containers and put them away. To go and eat, that's eating. That's not bayr. Same thing over here, says the Ramah by toichen. Grinding. There's no isser to cut up something to eat a salad, even if you're cutting it up into small pieces. That's derech achila. Toichen, right? Think about it. Nobody takes wheat kernels and grinds up wheat kernels to make flour, to take a teaspoon of flour and eat flour. You go ahead and you grind up wheat kernels into flour in order to create a 25-pound sack of flour. Why? So you should have flour for the next few weeks. That's toichen. Says the Ramah, the format of the malach of toichen is not to go cut up a cucumber, put it in a salad, add salad dressing, and eat it. And therefore, says the Ramah, that la'alter, for immediate use, is a mitigating factor that you could use to be matir the isser of toichen. Okay? Let's see a very critical Mishnah Berurah over here. Mishnah Berurah, ois cotton, membes. A few critical Mishnah Berurahs. That's going to take us through the end of the shir. It's going to take us through the rest of the Mishnah Berurahs on this page. Says the Mishnah Berurah, cotton membes. The Ramah said, v'chol zeh loy mairi. What's the kol zeh that the Ramah is talking about? Including what we mentioned all the way at the beginning of Sif Yud Beis, the isser of cutting up a vegetable into small pieces. That's only when you're doing it for later use. But it's cut mem gimel. If you're doing it lachlai miyad, if you're doing it for immediate use to eat it right away, then the Ramah says it's mutter. The Mishnah Berurah reminds us of something that we learned in Hilchas Bayr, and that is that when we say that there's a mitigating factor in the isser of Bayr for immediate use, it doesn't necessarily have to mean for your immediate use. You could be the woman of the household, and you're cutting it up for other people to eat it immediately, even if you're not going to partake. Then the heter of la'alter also applies. So here by toichen. The Ramah's heter of la'alter doesn't mean that you have to be eating it right away, even if somebody else is eating it right away. V'kedar mina la'el eitzel ber. Ois cotton mem dalid ha-koil. The Ramah said ha-koil shari. If it's for immediate use, everything is mutter. Hatam. The explanation of the Ramah is that the Ramah holds the loy shaykh shem tchina kishemechatich besakin. Very important. First of all, the Ramah's heter is only if you're using a knife. The Ramah's heter of la'alter use does not apply if you're using a specialized keli that's miyuchad l'tchina. So there's never a heter to use a grater. Even according to the Ramah, you can't use a grater to grate something for immediate use. You can't use a masher to mash something for immediate use. There's never a heter to use a kli hamiyuchad l'tchina. So Rabbi say, you can't use a masher even to mash eggs for egg salad. Even though eggs are not gedulei karka, you still can't use a specialized mashing or grinding implement on Shabbos. So even this heter of the Ramah, which the Ramah's matir bona fide toichen, you want to grind something that's gedulei karka, and the Ramah's matir it for immediate use only with a knife. Right? That's, you take a look at the Ramah. The Ramah says v'chol zeh loy mairi ela b'choitech umaniach. Avalim lachlei miyad, if you're cutting for immediate use, hakol shari, but that's when you're cutting with a knife. So says the Mishnah Berurah, tam doli shaykh shem tchina kishemechatech besakin. We're not going to apply the isser of tchina when you're cutting something with a knife. Ela b'toichen lohaniach. Only if you're cutting it up to put it away for later use. But for immediate consumption, vadai deshari, that's vadai mutter. Why? Because the Torah didn't answer the way you eat. The Torah didn't say, oh, you could only eat big pieces. Oh, you could only eat small pieces. Derech achila, the Torah lets you do what you want. Im kain have a derech achila bekach. So it's derech achila. Therefore, it's not toichen, and therefore it's mutter. That's the explanation of the Ramah's heter. V'hoadin, says the Mishnah Berurah, in meichen a yerek tak tak lifter tanagoylin shelo yoichle miyad. This would also be mutter for chickens. You want to cut up cucumber into tiny pieces to feed it to your chickens immediately? The Ramah's heter would exist. You use a knife. You're not using a specialized implement. You're doing it for la'alter use. According to the Ramah, it would be mutter. Gam ken shari ha'olam uzanois an alecha. Since you have a chiyuv to feed your animals, this would be mutter. Now, it would only be mutter if the chickens can't eat it without you cutting it up. If the chickens could eat it without you cutting it up, it would fall under the isser of a tercha yisera on Shabbos. Oiskot memhei. So the Ramah has his heter, shari. He says in these cases, taikin would be mutter. Says the Mishnah Berurah, v'yesh mefakfikin al heter zeh. There are those that take great exception to the heter of the Ramah, and in the Sharet Zion he brings this down from the Magen Avram in the name of the Shiltei Giborim. Says the Mishnah Berurah, v'yesh mefakfikin al heter zeh. The Gam beBeis Yosef Kosav, and the Beis Yosef himself, the Mechaber, on the Torah, he also writes, Sha'af misha mechaven lechel miyad, even somebody who wants to prepare something for immediate consumption, Gam ken yizar lachtoich lechatichois gedoylois ktsas. Even when you're doing something for la'alter use, you should be sure to cut it into somewhat large pieces. So even for la'alter use, you should not cut up small pieces. Ubitimes then, for this reason, kasu kama achreinim, any achreinim, right? Gam kain the nachain lehisnai k'moshe kasav Beis Yosef, that we should be noyeg like the Beis Yosef, and even if we're cutting for la'alter use, we should cut somewhat large pieces. However, people who are noyeg to cut onions or radishes into little pieces, ein limchais biyadam, we should not object if they're doing it for immediate use. If they're doing it for immediate use, they have a Ramah. So we shouldn't object to what they're doing. We can't go tell them, hey, what you're doing is usher. No, they're doing like a Ramah. We can't protest. Nevertheless, also but certainly you have to make sure that you're doing it for la'alter use, which means if you're doing it for the day Suda, it should be after people are coming on from shul already. Or at least, like we learned, the normal amount of time that you prepare for the immediately coming Suda. The Be'inan Samach L'Suda Mamish, K'moshe Kasav B'Simin Shin Yotes, and L'Chos Bar, Lydian Bar. V'achoytchem ha'betzalim v'atznoin dak, those who cut up onions or radishes, dak into very small pieces, shah oishtayim kaidem ha'suda, an hour or two before the Suda, karoiv hadavar loymar shechayev chatos. Chavetz Chaim says this is kemat an issa daraisa. V'habitzalim asurim b'achila. And since it could be an issa daraisa, that would render the onions asur la'achila, because it's something that a Yisrael did an issa daraisa with. V'gam da'az asur mishum Berurah. You also are going to come up with a Berurah shaila, because we're going to learn later on that peeling onions, peeling garlic on Shabbos, you're going to come up with Berurah issues when you remove the peel from the onion. Ayin b'soif ha-simin b'haga, we're going to see this at the end of our current simin. Ken kasa b'chayodam. V'ayin b'bir halacha. Finally, when it comes to halacha l'maisa, the Mishnah Berurah tells us, take a look at the bir halacha dibra maskal midi. Tahaheter shazachar b'haga hainu kishachoytcha b'sakin. Made this point in the previous Mishnah Berurah, that this whole heter of the Ramah, of cutting up something small for immediate use, is only when you cut it with a knife. Avak kishachoytcha b'kliya miyuchad l'kach. But to use a kli that's miyuchet for tchina, a specialized grinding implement, that's lakach near the asa b'chol gavda kishachayt dak. To cut something small with a specialized implement will always be aser. The gam bebar gufa in b'kli amiyuchet lebreira b'chol gavda chayiv v'getalel b'shin yud tes. Well, if he's there, mistaber di'esh lizar b'masha noigin lachtech b'tzalam dak im dog maluach v'kayotza. Somebody has to be very careful. If he's cutting up onions into small pieces to mix with his herring, with his salted fish, Shalayachteche bekli shekern hakmeser. You can't use a specialized keli. The efshir the kosher the kli miyuchad. This would be considered a specialized keli for grinding. So even if you're going to employ the heter of the Ramah, that you're cutting it up to mix it with your herring for immediate use by Kiddush, still you can't use a hakmeser because you can't use a specialized keli. Rak besakin ba'alma. And using a specialized keli would also be also because of uvda dechayel. The chanal b'sif yud. Hamafarach hatichas eitz shenerkav. Somebody who's crumbling up an old rotten piece of wood. V'oisem imenu pulver. He's making pulverized wood. V'chein hamafaret tzror ofar. Or somebody who takes clumps of earth and grinds them up. Chayiv mishum teichen. So this is the rice of teichen. Somebody who creates wood shavings on Shabbos to use this wood shavings, or somebody files metal filings, that would be an issa daraisa as soon as you shave off even a minute amount. Somebody who cuts small pieces of wood for kindling. If he creates enough small pieces of kindling, the amount that he would need to cook an egg that's the size of a dried fig, it would be an iser da'araisa. If he's cutting them into somewhat large pieces, and he's cutting it up. In those days, they were accustomed, when you were cutting pieces of wood, I guess you cut them into certain sized pieces. If you're doing this the way people generally chop wood, so you might not be over on the malacha of teichen because you're creating big pieces, not small pieces, but you still would be running afoul of the isser of mechatech. Kemuvur b'Rambam, Perek Yud Aleph, Mehilchos Shabbos. So, Hayotze midvarenu is that you have to be very, very careful when you're cutting up vegetables, you're cutting up fruits, you're making a salad, you're making a fruit salad, cutting vegetables into small pieces. And we brought down the Shilti Giborim that we don't know exactly what small pieces are, but when you cut up salads on Shabbos, you have to be careful. You can't cut them up into small pieces. You have the heter of the Ramah to cut very small pieces if you're doing it for immediate use. We see here that the Mishnah Berurah and others are not happy with relying on the heter of cutting it up into small pieces, and this is a Mishnah Berurah here. So the psak of the Chavetz Chaim in the Mishnah Berurah is that we should be careful to cut somewhat large pieces when you're cutting up a salad. Even when you cut up somewhat large pieces, it is definitely preferential to do it very close to the Suda so that you could employ the heter of the Ramah as well, since we don't know for sure what constitutes small pieces. Okay, we're going to stop for here for now. We'll continue next time with Sif Yud Gimel. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. This list of limud HaTorah should be Megan on God's Klal Yisrael. The Baruch Shem should send Yeshua's, Refuah's, Panas, and Shidduchim to all those in need. We should be zeicher to see the Bias Gal Tzedek. B'mher v'yameinu. Amen. Be well.